The sound of heels clicking against the polished marble floor echoed in the bustling shopping mall as Lisa Carter made her way through the rows of high-end stores. Her steps were deliberate, her posture straight, and her face, though relaxed, held a certain determination. A casual observer would not guess the weight of the world she carried on her shoulders. After all, Lisa wasn't just any woman. She was a civil rights attorney known for her tireless work in the courtroom and wife of the city's police chief, Mark Carter. Lisa paused outside a store window, eyeing a sleek, black dress. She smiled to herself. "It's been ages since I bought something just for me," she thought. Being married to a man like Mark and balancing her own demanding career meant there was little time for frivolities. But today felt different. Today, she wanted to indulge a little. As she entered the boutique, the subtle, sweet scent of perfume hit her, mixed with the hushed murmur of other customers browsing through the racks of designer clothes. Lisa walked to the back of the store, flipping through hangers with one hand, her mind drifting to the cases waiting on her desk. That moment of peace was soon interrupted by a sensation she couldn't shake, the unsettling feeling of being watched. At first, she ignored it. She wasn't the type to let paranoia get the better of her, but the sensation grew stronger. Casually glancing over her shoulder, she caught sight of him, a white man in uniform, his sharp eyes locked on her every move. His badge gleamed under the store's soft lighting, and his expression was unreadable but stern. Lisa's stomach churned slightly. She had dealt with her share of prejudice in the courtroom, but in her personal life, she tried not to let it consume her. She brushed it off, continuing to shop. After all, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She didn't have to explain herself. Still, she could feel him there, lurking in the shadows of the store, pretending to browse but always keeping her in his peripheral vision. After making her selection, Lisa approached the register, pulling out her credit card. The sales associate gave her a warm smile, unfazed by the presence of the officer just behind them. "Will that be all for you today, ma'am?" the associate asked. "Yes, that'll be all," Lisa replied. Her voice calm though her heart was beating a little faster now. She handed over her card and waited, feeling the officer's gaze burning into the back of her head. As the transaction was processed, Lisa turned slightly and caught the officer's eyes once again. There was something unnerving about the way he stared at her, something accusatory. She wondered if he had seen her from the start, or if he had followed her in. "Thank you for shopping with us," the associate said, handing Lisa her bag. "Thank you," she responded, but her tone was distracted. As she walked out of the store, the officer moved in step with her, just a few feet behind. Lisa's throat tightened. She clutched the handle of her shopping bag a little tighter, and with a swift motion, reached for her phone. Before she could dial Mark's number, the officer's voice cut through the air, sharp and authoritative. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some ID." Lisa stopped dead in her tracks, turning slowly to face him. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she maintained her composure. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. He stepped closer, his hand resting on the belt where his gun was holstered. "You were acting suspiciously back there. I need to make sure you didn't take anything that doesn't belong to you." Lisa's stomach dropped. She was no stranger to racial profiling, but this felt personal, like an affront not only to her, but to everything she stood for. Her eyes narrowed as she held his gaze. "I paid for everything in this bag. You can check with the store if you'd like." He took a step closer, his breath almost on her face now. "I'm asking you for your ID." There was a dangerous pause, the type of silence that happens before a storm. People around them had started to slow down, sensing the tension but too afraid to intervene. Lisa could feel the eyes of the crowd, but her focus was on the man in front of her. He wasn't backing down, and neither would she. "I'd like to speak with my attorney," she said, holding up her phone. "I have the right to remain silent, and unless you have a reason for detaining me, I'll be on my way." The officer's jaw clenched. "Don't play games with me," he snapped, his voice a low growl. "You people think you can just walk around here doing whatever you want." The words hit her like a punch. "You people." It was a phrase she'd heard countless times before, but it never stung less. "I'm going to need to search your bag," he said, reaching out as if to grab it from her. Lisa jerked her arm back. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice firm, louder now. The officer's face flushed with anger. He stepped even closer, and before Lisa could react, his hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a force that sent her stumbling backward. A gasp escaped her lips as she tried to maintain her balance. The crowd had grown now, with phones held high, capturing the unfolding scene. Some murmured in concern, while others simply watched in disbelief. "I said," Lisa began, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury, "you have no right." Before she could finish, the officer's fist connected with her cheek, and the world went black. Lisa woke to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the distant beep of hospital machines. Her body ached, her face throbbing where the officer had struck her. As her eyes fluttered open, she saw the concerned face of Mark hovering above her, his expression a mix of worry and anger. "Lisa," he whispered, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm so sorry." She blinked, trying to make sense of everything. "Mark." Her voice was hoarse. What happened?" "You were attacked," Mark said, his voice tight. "One of my officers, Richard Blake. He followed you, accused you of stealing, and then he hit you." Lisa's memory flooded back in painful clarity. The confrontation, the accusation, the blow. Her hand instinctively went to her cheek, wincing at the sharp sting. "I didn't think he'd." Her words trailed off as the gravity of the situation sunk in. "I've seen the footage," Mark continued, his voice low. "Everyone's seen it. It's all over the internet now. Richard. He's claiming you resisted arrest." Lisa closed her eyes, her breath shallow. I didn't resist," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I know," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know. And we're going to make this right." Lisa opened her eyes, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation, the injustice she had just experienced. But something more troubled her, a creeping sense of dread that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Back at the precinct, the tension was palpable. Officers whispered among themselves, glancing over their shoulders every time Mark passed. He had made it clear that there would be consequences, but as he stood in his office, watching the video of his wife's assault for the 100th time, he knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was his deputy, a young, eager officer named Jake. "Chief," he began cautiously, "the press is outside. They're asking for a statement." Mark's eyes flicked to the clock. It was too soon to address the media, too soon to face the whirlwind that was about to engulf their lives. But he had no choice. "Give me a minute," he said, his voice gruff. "I'll be right out." As Jake left the room, Mark ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of his badge more heavily than ever before. He knew what had to be done. Richard Blake couldn't stay on the force. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But Mark also knew that this was bigger than just one officer's misconduct. It was a reflection of something rotten that had been festering in the department for years. And now, because of Lisa, it was all coming to the surface. In the hospital, Lisa lay awake, staring at the small TV mounted on the wall. The news anchor's voice filled the room, her image displayed in the corner of the screen. A local civil rights attorney and wife of Police Chief Mark Carter was attacked earlier today in an incident that is rapidly gaining national attention. Footage of the altercation has gone viral, sparking outrage across social media. Lisa closed her eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. There would be no returning to normal after this. The steady beep of machines filled the sterile hospital room. Lisa Carter stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, the harsh lights causing her to squint. She wasn't sure how long she had been out, but the weight of the events leading up to this moment hit her all at once. Her cheek throbbed, and her body felt heavy, the kind of exhaustion that wasn't just physical. "Lisa?" Mark's voice was soft, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. He sat beside her, his large hand gently resting on hers. His face, usually so composed, was now tight with a mix of worry and anger. "How are you feeling?" Lisa blinked, trying to orient herself. Her voice was raspy as she spoke. Like I got hit by a truck. She winced, reaching up to touch her bruised face. The memory of the punch flooded back. Richard Blake's furious eyes, the crowd, the chaos. Her stomach twisted at the thought. Mark's grip on her hand tightened. I saw the footage, he muttered through clenched teeth. That bastard. He'll pay for what he did. Lisa exhaled slowly, still trying to process everything. It's not just about me, Mark. It's everything. The way he looked at me, the way he assumed. God, I've fought against this for years in the courtroom, and now I'm... Her voice broke, and she swallowed hard, fighting back tears. Now I'm another victim. You are not a victim, Mark said firmly, though his own frustration was palpable. He stood abruptly, pacing the small room. You are the strongest person I know, Lisa. But what he did, it's unforgivable. And I swear, I'm going to make sure he's held accountable. Lisa watched him pace, feeling a swell of conflicting emotions. She appreciated Mark's passion, but something about his tone worried her. Mark, she said softly, drawing his attention back to her. Don't lose yourself in this. Please. We can't let anger drive us. He stopped, his back to her, staring at the window overlooking the city below. You think I can just let this go? He asked, his voice low. You think I can just move on from seeing my wife attacked? By one of my officers? His voice cracked slightly on the last word, revealing just how deeply this had cut him. I'm not asking you to move on, Lisa said, her voice gentle but firm. But we have to be smart about this. You're the police chief. Everyone's watching. If you lose control now, it won't just be about Richard Blake. It'll be about the entire department. And you... Mark turned to face her, his expression torn. He knew she was right, but the weight of his emotions made it hard to think clearly. I can't stand the thought of him walking free, he whispered, his shoulders sagging slightly. He won't, Lisa said, with a quiet conviction. But we'll do this the right way. You know we have to. Before Mark could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. A nurse poked her head in, offering a sympathetic smile. Sorry to interrupt. There's someone here to see you, Mrs. Carter. Lisa frowned, confused. Who is it? The nurse stepped aside, and a tall man in a crisp suit entered the room. His expression was grim, his eyes scanning Lisa's injuries with a mixture of concern and professionalism. Mrs. Carter, Chief Carter, he greeted them both. I'm James Wright, an attorney representing the city. I wanted to check in and discuss the situation with you both. Mark's jaw tightened, and Lisa could feel the shift in the room immediately. She knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. What exactly do you want to discuss, Mr. Wright? Mark asked, his tone sharp. Wright cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. The city is, well, we're anticipating a lot of media attention on this incident. We want to ensure that the situation is handled delicately. Delicately? Lisa repeated, her eyes narrowing. I was assaulted, Mr. Wright, by a police officer. What exactly do you mean by delicately? Of course, Wright said quickly, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. I didn't mean to minimize what happened to you, but given your position and Chief Carter's, the city wants to avoid any unnecessary escalation. There's a lot at stake here, politically speaking. Lisa felt her blood begin to boil. So, what you're saying is, you want to protect the city's reputation, not hold Richard Blake accountable for what he did to me. That's not what I'm saying at all, Wright protested, though his tone lacked sincerity. We just need to be careful about how we proceed. The media, public perception, these things matter. Mark stepped forward, his towering presence making Wright visibly uneasy. What matters, Mark said, his voice dangerously low, is that my wife was attacked. And the fact that you're standing here, talking about politics instead of justice, is the problem. Wright swallowed hard, clearly aware he was walking on thin ice. I understand your frustration, Chief Carter. I do. But if we go about this the wrong way, it could create a firestorm. The kind of attention this department doesn't need right now. The department doesn't need it? Lisa said, her voice dripping with disbelief. What about me? What about the people who are constantly subjected to this kind of treatment? You think this is just going to go away because it's inconvenient for the city? Wright shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Lisa and Mark. I'm just here to advise you both to proceed with caution. This isn't just a legal matter, it's political. And that complicates things. Mark's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his restraint barely holding. You can leave now, Mr. Wright, he said through gritted teeth. Wright opened his mouth to argue, but seemed to think better of it. He gave a stiff nod instead. If you need anything from the city, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, he turned and left the room, the tension lingering in the air long after he was gone. Mark exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. Can you believe that guy? He muttered, his voice thick with frustration. Lisa shook her head, her mind still racing from the conversation. It's all politics to them. They don't care about justice. They just want to protect themselves. Well, I don't give a damn about their politics, Mark growled, pacing again. This isn't going to be swept under the rug. Not this time. Lisa watched him for a moment, her heart aching. She knew how deeply this was affecting him, how much it hurt to know that one of his own officers had done this. But she also knew they were up against something much bigger than Richard Blake. We need a plan, Lisa said quietly, her mind already working through the possibilities. If we're going to fight this, we need to be prepared for the backlash. You know they're going to come after you, Mark. They're going to try to discredit us both. I don't care what they do, Mark replied, his voice hard. I'm not backing down. I know you're not, Lisa said, reaching out to take his hand. But we have to be smart. We need to gather all the evidence, get statements from witnesses, and make sure the media has the right story. If they control the narrative, we lose. Mark met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. You're right. As always, Lisa managed a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I just want this to be over, she whispered. I want to feel safe again. Mark sat down beside her, pulling her into his arms. I'll make sure you're safe, he promised. I swear it. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the media frenzy had already begun. Reporters lined the street, their cameras pointed toward the entrance, eager for any scrap of information they could report on. The video of Lisa's assault had gone viral, sparking outrage across social media, and now the world was watching. In the crowd, a young reporter named Sarah Jenkins clutched her microphone, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nerves. This was the story of a lifetime, one that could make or break her career. She glanced at her cameraman, who gave her a nod, signaling they were live. This is Sarah Jenkins, reporting live from Mercy Hospital, she began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. We are here following the brutal assault of civil rights attorney Lisa Carter, wife of Police Chief Mark Carter, by one of his own officers. The incident has sparked a national conversation about police brutality and racial profiling, with many calling for the immediate resignation of Officer Richard Blake. As Sarah continued her report, the hospital doors opened, and a figure stepped out. The reporters surged forward, microphones raised, but it wasn't Lisa or Mark who emerged. It was Richard Blake. Wearing a dark suit and flanked by two lawyers, Richard's face was set in a defiant scowl. He moved quickly, ignoring the barrage of questions being thrown at him, his eyes focused straight ahead. But as he reached his car, he paused for just a moment, turning to face the crowd of reporters. I was just doing my job, he said, his voice carrying over the noise. She resisted arrest. The truth will come out. And with that, he disappeared into his car, leaving the reporters clamoring for more, the tension only growing as the battle lines were drawn. Mark Carter stood before the large, wooden desk in his office, staring at the stack of reports that had been piling up. His fingers tapped against the polished surface, his jaw clenched. The footage of Lisa's attack replayed in his mind for the 1,000th time, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the confrontation he knew had to happen. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called, his voice gruff. The door swung open, and Richard Blake entered the room, his posture cocky, his face carrying the same smug arrogance Mark had seen in the video. Richard had no idea what was about to happen. Chief, Richard greeted casually, as if he hadn't just assaulted the chief's wife days earlier. "You wanted to see me?" Mark stared at him for a long moment, his dark eyes narrowing. "Close the door," he ordered, his tone sharp. Richard's smirk faltered slightly, but he complied, closing the door behind him. "What's this about?" he asked, feigning innocence. "I've got paperwork piling up." Mark didn't respond immediately. He stood from his chair, slowly rounding the desk until he was standing directly in front of Richard, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the officer. The silence in the room was suffocating. "You assaulted my wife," Mark finally said, his voice low and controlled, but dripping with barely restrained rage. Richard blinked, his smirk returning as he shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your wife resisted arrest." "Shut your mouth," Mark growled, his fists clenching. "Don't you dare try to spin this like it's something it's not. You followed her, you harassed her, and then you hit her. I've seen the footage, Blake. Everyone has." Richard's confidence wavered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I was doing my job," he said defensively. "She was acting suspiciously, and when I asked for her ID, she refused. What was I supposed to do? Just let her walk away?" Mark stepped even closer, his face inches from Richard's now. "You're done," he whispered, his voice deadly calm. "You're done. I've got enough evidence to not only suspend you, but to have you prosecuted. You'll never wear a badge again." Richard's bravado crumbled at Mark's words. His face paled, and for the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. "You can't do that," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I have rights too." Mark's eyes blazed with fury. "Rights? You want to talk to me about rights? After what you did? You think you're untouchable because you've gotten away with this crap before, but this time, you went too far. You assaulted my wife, and you're going to pay for it." Richard's hands shook as he took a step back, his face growing red with anger and panic. "I didn't know she was your wife," he shouted. "If I'd known, I wouldn't have." Mark's fist slammed into the desk, rattling the items on it. "It shouldn't have mattered who she was," he roared. "You think it's okay to treat people like that as long as they're not connected to someone important? You think it's fine to abuse your authority because they're just regular citizens?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He stood there, floundering, his arrogance shattered. Mark shook his head, disgusted. "Get out of my sight," he said quietly. "You'll hear from the disciplinary board soon enough." For a brief moment, Richard hesitated, as if he wanted to argue, but he thought better of it. Without another word, he turned and left the room, slamming the door behind him. Mark collapsed back into his chair, the weight of the confrontation settling over him like a heavy blanket. He ran a hand over his face, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A knock at the door came again, softer this time. "Chief." It was Jake, his deputy. He entered cautiously, sensing the tension in the air. "Are you okay?" Mark let out a long breath, nodding slowly. "Yeah," he muttered, though his voice was laced with exhaustion. "I just had a conversation with Blake." Jake grimaced. "I heard. The whole station's buzzing about it." Mark raised an eyebrow, looking up at his deputy. "What are they saying?" Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Most of the guys are on your side. But there are a few who think Blake didn't do anything wrong." Mark's jaw clenched. "Of course there are," he muttered. "They think he's just doing his job, right?" Jake hesitated before answering. "It's more than that. Some of the officers, they're loyal to Blake. They think you're overreacting because of who your wife is." Mark's anger flared again, but he quickly reined it in. He had expected this. The department had always been divided. There were those who believed in justice, in protecting the people, and then there were those who believed in power, in maintaining control at any cost. Blake was the face of that second group, and Mark knew this battle was bigger than just one officer. "It doesn't matter what they think," Mark said, his voice steely. "Blake's out, and anyone who supports him better think long and hard about where their loyalties lie." Jake nodded, though his expression was still troubled. "What do you want me to do, Chief?" Mark leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. "We need to get ahead of this," he said quietly. Call a meeting with the internal affairs team. I want a full investigation into Blake's conduct. And make sure every officer in this department knows that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated anymore. Jake's eyes widened slightly. You're serious about this, aren't you? Mark looked at him, his gaze unwavering. Dead serious. It's time we cleaned up this department. Meanwhile, Lisa sat in her hospital bed, flipping through the news on her phone. The incident had blown up even more than she had anticipated. Headlines about police brutality and racial profiling dominated every major outlet, and social media was flooded with discussions, opinions, and debates. Her own face was plastered across countless news sites, her name now synonymous with the latest example of systemic injustice. She sighed, placing her phone down. The public attention was overwhelming, but what troubled her more was the internal battle Mark was facing. She knew the kind of man he was, the kind of leader he wanted to be, but this situation was forcing him to confront the darker sides of the department he had spent years trying to change. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and Lisa looked up to see her best friend, Monica, standing in the doorway. Hey, Monica greeted with a small smile, stepping into the room. How are you holding up? Lisa smiled faintly. I'm okay, she replied. Just trying to process everything. Monica pulled a chair up to the bedside, her expression sympathetic. I saw the news. It's insane out there. People are protesting in front of the precinct. They're calling for Blake's head. Lisa sighed again, rubbing her temples. This is so much bigger than just Richard Blake. He's a symptom of a much deeper problem. I know, Monica said, her voice soft, but at least people are paying attention now. Maybe something good will come out of this. Lisa nodded, though her expression remained troubled. I just hope Mark can handle it. He's under so much pressure, and I know he feels responsible for everything. He's always tried to make things better, but it's different. Monica reached out, placing a comforting hand on Lisa's arm. Mark's strong. He'll get through this, and so will you. Lisa smiled, though her heart still felt heavy. I just want justice, she whispered. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been treated the way I was. Monica squeezed her hand. And you'll get it, one step at a time. Later that evening, Mark returned to the hospital, his face etched with exhaustion. Lisa looked up as he entered the room, her heart aching at the sight of him. Hey, she greeted softly. Hey, he replied, his voice rough. He sank into the chair beside her bed, rubbing his hands over his face. It's been a long day. I can imagine, Lisa said, reaching out to take his hand. How did it go? Mark let out a heavy sigh. I confronted Blake, told him he's done. But it's not just about him anymore. There's a whole group of officers who think like him, and they're not happy with me. Lisa's heart sank. I was afraid of that, she murmured. Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and weariness. I'm not backing down, Lisa. I can't. This department, it's broken, and I'm going to fix it, no matter what it takes. Lisa squeezed his hand, her voice soft but firm. You don't have to do it alone. Mark smiled faintly, leaning in to kiss her forehead. I know, he whispered, and that's the only reason I can keep going. The precinct was tense, buzzing with rumors and quiet murmurs. Mark Carter stood at the front of the conference room, staring down at the officers seated before him. The air was thick with unease, and the room felt stifling under the weight of what was about to unfold. In front of him was a stack of documents, evidence that would soon shatter the fragile pretense many in the department had clung to. He looked at each officer in turn, some avoiding his gaze, while others met his eyes with a mixture of defiance and unease. Richard Blake sat near the back, his jaw tight, arms crossed. The arrogance that usually accompanied him was missing, replaced by a simmering anger. I've called this meeting, Mark began, his voice steady but cold, because we need to address the incident that has shaken not only this department, but our entire community. There were shifting movements, nervous glances exchanged among the officers. Mark could feel the resistance in the room. He was about to break the silence that had protected so many for so long. Some of you may think I'm overreacting, that this is about personal feelings. Let me assure you, this is about much more than what happened to my wife. Mark's eyes locked onto Richard's. This is about accountability. This is about justice. A ripple of discomfort ran through the room, and Richard finally broke his silence. You're making a mistake, Chief, he said, his voice filled with defiance. I was doing my job. She resisted. Enough, Mark interrupted, his voice sharp, cutting through the room like a knife. This is not a debate, Blake. This is not about your skewed version of events. This is about the facts. He walked to the center of the room, holding up a remote. With a click, the screen behind him flickered to life, showing security footage from the shopping mall. Let's take a look at the truth. The video began to play, showing Lisa browsing in the store, her movements calm, normal. Then, the moment Richard began to follow her, his predatory gaze on her every move. The officers watched in silence as the footage showed Richard confronting her, the escalating tension clear in every frame. And then, the blow. The room seemed to hold its breath as Lisa fell to the floor, the impact of Richard's punch silencing even the most hardened of the officers. Mark turned off the screen, his expression unreadable. This is what happened, he said, his voice softer now, but filled with a weight that none of them could ignore. This is what Blake did, and this is what you all have to reckon with. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, the truth laid bare before them. You can't suspend me for this, Richard suddenly barked, standing from his seat. You're just doing this because it was your wife. Anyone else, and this wouldn't even be an issue. Mark's eyes flashed with anger, but he maintained his composure. You're wrong, he said, his voice firm. This would have been an issue regardless of who it was. But the fact that you think it wouldn't be tells me everything I need to know about you, and about the culture that's infected this department for too long. Richard's face reddened, his fists clenching at his sides. I won't let you ruin my career over this. It's already ruined, Mark replied coldly. You did that the moment you chose to use your badge as a weapon instead of a shield. The room was thick with tension, the other officers sitting in stunned silence. They had seen Mark angry before, but never like this. His fury was restrained, a cold, simmering rage that left no room for excuses. Mark turned his back to Richard, addressing the rest of the room. I know some of you are loyal to him, he said, his voice quieter now. I know some of you think that this is just how things are, that this is part of the job. But let me make one thing clear. This behavior will no longer be tolerated in my department. If you can't accept that, if you think that abusing your power is acceptable, then you can leave now. There's no place for you here. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one moved. The weight of Mark's words hung heavy in the air, a line drawn in the sand. Mark turned back to Richard, his expression hard. You're suspended, effective immediately. You'll be facing charges. Now, get out of my station. Richard's face twisted in anger, but he knew there was nothing he could do. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Mark stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving with the effort of holding back his emotions. Finally, he let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. You're dismissed, he said to the room, his voice weary. Go to your jobs. The officers filed out quietly, leaving Mark standing alone in the conference room, the echoes of the confrontation still ringing in his ears. Later that evening, Mark returned home, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He found Lisa sitting on the couch, a book in her lap, though she wasn't reading it. Her eyes were distant, lost in thought. Hey, Mark said softly, sitting beside her. Lisa glanced up at him, offering a small smile. Hey, how did it go? Mark let out a heavy sigh, leaning back against the couch. I suspended him. It wasn't pretty. Some of the officers, they're not happy about it. Lisa nodded, her eyes sad but resigned. I didn't expect it to be easy. It never is, Mark muttered, rubbing his temples. But it had to be done. Lisa reached out, placing her hand on his. I'm proud of you, she said softly. I know how hard this is for you, especially with everything going on in the department. Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, he whispered. You've been my rock through all of this. Lisa smiled, though her heart was heavy. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen again, she said quietly. Not just for me, but for everyone else who's been through what I have. Mark nodded, his expression somber. We're going to change things, Lisa. It won't happen overnight, but we'll get there. Together. Lisa leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. I know, she murmured, but it feels like such an uphill battle. It is, Mark agreed, but we're not alone. People are starting to wake up. The protests, the support, it's growing. Lisa closed her eyes, letting out a long breath. I hope you're right. The protests outside the precinct had only grown in size over the last few days. Hundreds of people gathered with signs, chanting slogans, demanding justice for Lisa and an end to police brutality. The media presence was overwhelming, cameras capturing every moment, every voice that called for change. Inside the precinct, Mark watched the scene from his office window, his heart heavy. The protests were peaceful, but the tension was palpable. He knew that change was coming, but the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he glanced at it, seeing a text from Jake. Internal Affairs has finished their investigation. Blake is being charged officially tomorrow. Mark let out a breath of relief. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. He texted back, "Good. Make sure everything is airtight. No loose ends." As he set the phone down, a knock came at the door. It was Jake, looking more serious than usual. "Chief," Jake said, stepping into the office. "We've got a situation." Mark frowned, standing up. "What is it?" Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Some of the officers, they're planning to walk out." In support of Blake, Mark felt his stomach twist. He had known there would be backlash, but this was worse than he had anticipated. "How many?" "Enough to cause a problem," Jake said grimly. "They're saying they won't work under you anymore. That you've lost their trust." Mark clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Let them walk," he said coldly. "I won't tolerate anyone who thinks what Blake did was acceptable." Jake nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure," Mark replied, his voice firm. "We don't need them. We'll rebuild the department with officers who actually care about protecting the people they serve." Jake hesitated for a moment before nodding again. "I'll let the rest of the team know." As Jake left the office, Mark stared out the window once more, watching the protesters below. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. They would rebuild, and this time, they would do it right. The courthouse was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with reporters and community members standing along the walls, anxiously awaiting the verdict. The tension in the air was palpable. Lisa Carter sat quietly beside her attorney, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap. Despite the support that had grown around her, she felt the weight of this moment pressing down on her chest. Mark sat behind her, his gaze steady on the judge, though inside, he was a storm of emotions. It had been months of legal battles, media scrutiny, and personal attacks. Richard Blake's trial had become a flashpoint in the larger discussion of police brutality and systemic injustice, and everyone in that room knew the significance of what was about to happen. The jury had been deliberating for hours, and the wait was agonizing. Lisa leaned back slightly, feeling Mark's presence behind her. She didn't need to look at him to know he was just as tense as she was. His steady hand reached forward, brushing hers gently. Finally, the door to the jury room opened, and the jurors filed in, their faces unreadable. Lisa's heart raced as the judge asked for the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Blake, guilty of assault in the second degree and abuse of authority." A collective gasp echoed through the room, followed by a wave of murmurs. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air, almost surreal. Guilty. She had been bracing herself for a different outcome, knowing how these cases often went, but hearing it now, it felt like a weight had been lifted, if only slightly. Mark exhaled deeply, his grip tightening on the back of Lisa's chair. Relief washed over him, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just one battle won in a much larger war. As the judge began to issue instructions, Lisa's attorney leaned in, whispering, "This is a victory, Lisa. It sets a precedent." Lisa nodded, though her mind was racing. A precedent, yes, but the fight wasn't over. This was a step, not the end. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown even larger. News cameras were everywhere, capturing every reaction, every interview. As Lisa and Mark stepped out into the sunlight, they were met with cheers and applause from the protesters and supporters who had gathered. Signs reading, "Justice for Lisa" and "End Police Brutality" were raised high above the crowd. Monica was there, rushing forward to embrace Lisa tightly. "You did it!" she exclaimed, her eyes brimming with emotion. Lisa hugged her back, but there was a somberness to her. "We did it," she corrected softly. "But this is just the beginning." Mark stood nearby, shaking hands with various community leaders and activists. He felt the energy in the air, the hope that this verdict would spark real change. But he also knew how fragile that hope could be. Change didn't come overnight. A reporter pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand, eager for a comment. Mrs. Carter, how do you feel about the verdict?" Lisa hesitated, glancing at Mark before stepping forward. "I feel relieved," she began, her voice steady despite the whirlwind around her. "But this isn't just about me. Today, we took a step toward accountability. But there are so many others who haven't gotten justice, who are still waiting. This fight is far from over." The reporter nodded, jotting down notes furiously. "What's next for you? How do you plan to continue this fight?" Lisa took a deep breath. "We need reform, not just in this city, but across the country. I plan to work with community leaders, lawmakers, and activists to push for real, systemic change. This can't happen again." The crowd erupted in applause, but Lisa's heart remained heavy. She appreciated the support, the momentum, but she knew how easily it could fade. They had to keep pushing. That evening, Lisa and Mark returned home, exhausted but unable to fully relax. Their home had become a symbol of the struggle, with protesters often camped outside in support, and media vans still parked down the street. As they entered, Lisa collapsed onto the couch, kicking off her shoes and rubbing her temples. "I didn't think I'd be this tired," she muttered, leaning her head back. Mark sat beside her, his arm draping over her shoulders. "It's been a long road," he agreed. "But you were incredible today." Lisa smiled faintly, though the weight of everything still clung to her. "I don't know how I feel," she admitted. "I mean, we won, but it doesn't feel like a victory." Mark nodded slowly, understanding her conflicted emotions. "I know, but this is bigger than just today. What happened in that courtroom? It's a start. And now we have to make sure it means something." Lisa turned to look at him, her eyes searching his. "How do we keep going, Mark? How do we make sure this doesn't just fade away once the cameras leave?" Mark exhaled deeply, his gaze steady. "We keep fighting," he said simply. "We don't let them forget. You've got a voice, Lisa, and people are listening. You can lead this." Lisa leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I don't want to lead it alone." "You won't," Mark assured her, kissing the top of her head. "We'll do it together." Over the next few weeks, Lisa found herself thrust even deeper into the public eye. Invitations to speak at rallies, interviews with national news outlets, and meetings with lawmakers filled her days. The momentum was building, but it was exhausting. Every conversation felt like a battle, every appearance a reminder of the immense pressure she was under. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling meeting with city officials about police reform, Lisa returned home to find Monica waiting for her. "You look like you need a drink," Monica said, holding up a bottle of wine with a grin. Lisa chuckled, though it was tired. "You have no idea." They sat together on the back porch, sipping wine as the sun began to set. For a moment, the weight of everything lifted, and they could just be two friends, sharing a quiet evening. "I don't know how you're doing this," Monica said after a while, her voice soft. "I mean, I know you're strong, but this is something else." Lisa shrugged, staring out at the trees swaying in the breeze. "I don't know how I'm doing it either," she admitted. "But I can't stop now. Not when we've come this far." Monica nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You know, you've always been the one to stand up when no one else would. Even back in law school, You were the one pushing for the hard conversations. Lisa smiled faintly, remembering those days. I guess I've always been a little stubborn. A little? Monica teased, raising an eyebrow. They both laughed, the sound a brief respite from the heaviness that usually surrounded them. Seriously, though, Monica said, her tone more serious now. You're making a difference, Lisa. I hope you know that. Lisa sighed, swirling the wine in her glass. I just hope it's enough. It will be, Monica assured her, because you won't let it be anything else. As the weeks turned into months, Lisa's work continued. She became a key figure in the fight for police reform, working with lawmakers to draft new legislation and pushing for greater accountability within law enforcement. The road was long and filled with setbacks, but progress was being made. Mark stood by her side every step of the way, balancing his own responsibilities as police chief while supporting Lisa's efforts. Together, they navigated the challenges, knowing that the work they were doing was bigger than either of them. One evening, after a particularly intense meeting with the city council, Mark and Lisa sat together on their porch, watching the stars blink into existence overhead. You know, Mark said quietly, I think we're going to get there. It's going to take time, but I can see the change happening. Lisa nodded, her heart feeling a little lighter. I hope so. Sometimes it feels like we're just pushing a boulder uphill, and it keeps rolling back down. Mark smiled, squeezing her hand. That's how change always feels. But one day, that boulder's going to stay at the top. Lisa looked at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. I guess we'll just keep pushing then. Together, Mark said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Together, Lisa echoed, her heart full. As they sat there, hand in hand, the weight of the world felt a little lighter. They knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were ready. Together, they would continue to fight. And one day, they would win.